Good evening, and welcome to Inside Colombia's Crisis, where we break down the latest developments shaking the country. Tonight, we're covering two major issues: the Pegasus spyware scandal and the ongoing allegations of a right-wing coup attempt against President Gustavo Petro. To help us unpack all this, we have political analyst Juan Morales, who's been following the situation closely. Juan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. These are critical issues, and they're both interconnected in ways that reveal the complexity of Colombia's current political environment.
Absolutely. Let's dive right into the Pegasus scandal. For our viewers who may not be fully up to speed, this controversy centers around allegations that the Colombian government, under Iván Duque, secretly purchased the Pegasus spyware to conduct illegal surveillance. Juan, what can you tell us about the scale of this operation and its potential implications?
Well, Pegasus is a very advanced spyware that has been used in various countries to monitor journalists, human rights activists, and political dissidents. In Colombia, the allegations suggest that the Duque administration, while facing intense anti-government protests in 2021, acquired Pegasus to monitor the leaders of these demonstrations, possibly targeting protesters, activists, and even Petro's political allies. President Petro has taken this issue head-on, suggesting that the spyware may have been used not only against him and his campaign, but also against other political figures and civil society organizations. He has called for a full investigation, claiming that the purchase was done through a private flight to Israel, involving millions of dollars in cash.
And that's part of what makes this scandal so explosive, right? The idea that a sitting government could have used such tools against its own citizens, particularly during a time of heightened civil unrest.
Exactly. The protests in 2021 were largely against police brutality, economic inequality, and tax reforms proposed by Duque's administration. If it's proven that Pegasus was used to infiltrate the private communications of the protesters, it would be a gross violation of civil liberties. Petro has been vocal about how the protests were mishandled, and this spyware angle adds a new layer of complexity to that narrative. It also raises questions about how deep this surveillance went. Was it restricted to just the protest leaders, or were other sectors of Colombian society being monitored? The fact that these transactions allegedly involved cash smuggled in on a private flight only increases suspicions of a cover-up.
Let's talk about the investigation Petro has launched. What steps are being taken to get to the bottom of this? Is there cooperation from other branches of government?
That's where things get complicated. Petro has called on Colombians to check their devices for signs of Pegasus infiltration, and he's urged transparency from all government entities. However, many of the institutions that would handle such investigations were established during Duque's administration or are run by individuals with ties to the previous government. This means that there's likely to be resistance, or at least slow progress, on any internal investigations. Moreover, while Petro is calling for international observers to step in, the opposition is claiming that this is just a distraction from other issues facing his government.
Speaking of distractions, that brings us to the other issue at hand, the allegations of a coup attempt. Recently, Petro gave a national address where he warned of a possible coup orchestrated by right-wing factions. What's the basis for these claims, and how has the public reacted?
This is one of the most dramatic moments of Petro's presidency so far. In his recent speech, he accused the right-wing opposition of attempting what he called a silent coup. He's not referring to a traditional military coup, but rather a more covert political maneuver aimed at removing him from office through legal and institutional channels. The specific trigger is an investigation launched by the National Electoral Council, CNE, into Petro's 2022 campaign finances. The CNE claims that Petro's campaign exceeded the legal spending limits.
And the president has argued that this investigation is unconstitutional, correct?
That's right. Petro and his allies argue that the CNE doesn't have the legal authority to investigate a sitting president, and they've framed the entire investigation as politically motivated. Petro has been very vocal in asserting that this is part of a larger conspiracy to undermine his administration. In his address, he called on the Colombian people to mobilize and defend democracy. He even ordered the military and police not to use force against protesters if they take to the streets, which is a significant move given the history of violent crackdowns during protests in Colombia.
That's a bold stance. How has the opposition responded to these accusations of a coup?
The right-wing factions Petro is accusing have dismissed his claims as paranoia and deflection. They argue that the investigation is legitimate and that Petro is trying to turn a routine campaign finance probe into a national crisis. The opposition's main argument is that Petro is overreacting to legal scrutiny, which every political figure should face. They insist that this is not about overthrowing the government, but ensuring transparency in the electoral process. However, Petro's supporters see this differently. They view the investigation as an attempt to roll back the progress made since Petro took office. His administration represents a significant departure from the traditional political elite that has governed Colombia for decades. Many of his supporters believe that these elites, particularly those aligned with the Duque administration, are trying to regain control by discrediting Petro.
So Petro's call for public mobilization is essentially a call to protect his mandate?
Exactly. Petro has framed this as a defense of democracy itself, stating that the CNE is trying to subvert the will of millions of Colombians who voted for him. He has asked grassroots organizations, unions, and social movements to stay alert and, if necessary, mobilize to defend the Constitution. This is why we're seeing such heightened tension across the country. On one side, you have Petro and his supporters accusing the opposition of anti-democratic behavior, and on the other, you have the opposition claiming that Petro is trying to avoid accountability.
Let's talk about potential outcomes. If the CNE continues with its investigation and finds that Petro's campaign did in fact exceed spending limits, what happens next?
That's the million-dollar question. If the CNE presses forward, it could lead to a political crisis, the likes of which Colombia hasn't seen in recent years. There's a real possibility that this could trigger mass protests, or even further attempts by Petro's administration to challenge the legality of the CNE's actions. On the flip side, if the CNE backs down, it will likely embolden Petro's government, but it could also deepen divisions within the political class.
Juan, thank you so much for this comprehensive breakdown. Seems like Colombia is at a political crossroads, and the next few weeks could be critical for the future of the country.
Absolutely. It's going to be a challenging time for Colombia, but hopefully the democratic process will prevail.
That was Juan Morales, with an in-depth look at the Pegasus spyware scandal and the rising political tensions in Colombia. Stay tuned as we continue to bring you updates on these unfolding events. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Join the conversation by sharing your insights in the comments below. Key political vocabulary from the interview.